So picture this. It is the suffocating heat of the Philadelphia summer, right? It's 1776.
Oh, a very famous summer.
Exactly. And Thomas Jefferson is sitting in this rented room, and he's drafting a sentence that is, I mean, it's literally going to change the trajectory of human history.
Right, the big one.
Yeah. He writes, with just this immense rhetorical power, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's this stunning, foundational moment of moral clarity.
It really is.
But there is the second reality happening in that exact same room on that exact same day.
And this is the part we usually tend to gloss over.
Totally. Because while Jefferson was writing those exact words, there was a teenage boy named Robert Hemings who was forced to serve him.
Right.
He was running his errands, attending to his daily needs, and Robert was only there because he was entirely legally owned by Thomas Jefferson as property.
Which is just, it is the ultimate historical record scratcher.
Yeah.
It stops you dead in your tracks, you know? You have this towering intellect articulating the absolute pinnacle of human freedom.
While simultaneously...
Exactly, while simultaneously participating in one of the most brutal, degrading systems of human subjugation ever devised.
It's a lot to process.
It really forces this massive collision in our modern minds. Like, do we celebrate the genius who wrote the words that birthed the democratic ideal?
Or do we condemn the man who enslaved the child standing literally right next to his desk?
Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
Today we are bringing you, and yes, I mean you, the listener, because you are the vital third person in this conversation, into a really tough topic.
It's one of the most complex, uncomfortable, and universally debated questions of our time, honestly.
We have a fascinating stack of notes today. It's a deeply layered philosophical and historical analysis piece.
And the core theme here is that big question. Is it right to judge people from the past by today's moral standards?
Because we all experience this jarring whiplash, right? You're reading a biography, or maybe you're walking through a museum, admiring a historical leader or a brilliant scientist.
Or revolutionary artists, yeah. And then just casually, you discover they defended slavery.
Or they actively excluded women from basic participation in society.
Right. Or they justified violent colonialism or just stayed totally comfortably silent in the face of immense cruelty.
And the moment that cognitive dissonance hits, a very predictable debate ignites.
Oh, always.
On one side, you have people throwing up a defensive wall, arguing that we cannot possibly judge these figures by today's standards.
Because they were simply, quote-unquote, people of their time.
Exactly. And then on the opposing side, you have people demanding absolute accountability.
Like, wrong is objectively wrong, regardless of what year the calendar says.
Right, but both of those reflexive reactions are fundamentally incomplete. This isn't just an academic exercise.
No, it's not just historians arguing over footnotes in a university lounge.
It dictates how we consume history. It shapes how we view our heroes, how we understand human complexity, and really how we construct our own moral compass.
Because if we get this wrong, if we blindly excuse atrocities as historical quirks,
Or if we aggressively condemn everyone who ever lived prior to the year 2000.
yeah, then we just lose our grip on the reality of the human story. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Our mission today is to figure out if judging history by modern standards is simply a necessary mechanism for calling out injustice.
Or if doing so is actually unfair, simplistic, and rooted in a kind of chronological arrogance.
And to do that, we have to start with the immediate visceral reaction.
The gut feeling.
Exactly. Before we get into the high-level historical methodologies or the philosophical frameworks, we have to validate that gut-level intuition.
The one that you, our listener, probably feel when you read about historical atrocities.
Right. Why is it that when we hear about someone committing a terrible act 300 years ago, our very first instinct is to condemn them?
It feels almost biological, honestly.
It really is.
And that instinct is not just natural. It is incredibly important. The research we're looking at today validates it right out of the gate.
Okay, how so?
Well, the underlying argument here rests on a concept that is painfully simple, but absolutely crucial for any historical analysis.
Which is?
Real harm was real.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. The passage of time does not possess some magical, neutralizing property that turns cruelty into innocence.
Right, because when we look at history, we often fall victim to this psychological distancing effect.
Oh, absolutely. We view the past through a sort of sepia-toned filter.
It's like we process history as a narrative film, like the blood wasn't really red, the screams weren't really loud.
And the systemic oppression was just a plot device and a costume drama.
Exactly. We intellectually know it happened, but we disconnect from the visceral reality of it.
And that distancing is a defense mechanism. But if people in the past enslaved others, or if they tortured dissidents,
Or if they denied basic dignity and bodily autonomy to whole demographics of human beings.
then the victims of those systems suffered an entirely real, entirely vivid present moment. Their pain was 100% real.
Yeah. The pain of a Roman galley slave or a victim of the Inquisition wasn't somehow mitigated.
It wasn't less painful just because it occurred centuries before we were born.
And the popularity of a cruel system does not dilute the cruelty for the person being crushed under its weight.
That is a crucial point.
Right. Like, if an entire society agrees that a certain group of people is less than human, the societal consensus doesn't make the subjugation any less agonizing.
Not for the subjugated, no.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here is how often we try to use societal consensus as a shield.
Oh, the classic excuse.
Yeah, the phrase that constantly echoes through these debates is, well, it's just different back then.
I hear that all the time.
And the analysis we are diving into points out the immense danger of that specific phrase.
It really is a massive cop-out.
Using "it was just different back then" to describe brutal, oppressive, or degrading systems is a profound linguistic cop-out.
Because it diminishes the reality of the suffering.
Exactly. It reduces systemic violence to a mere cultural quirk. Moral language matters deeply.
It seems to me that there is a massive categorical difference between historical etiquette and historical ethics.
That's a great way to put it.
And we often conflate the two to avoid uncomfortable conversations, you know?
We do.
Like, we can look back at the 16th century and say, wow, the way they structured their dinner parties and those massive ruffled collars they wore were just different back then.
Right. That is a matter of changing tastes.
But when we are talking about the fundamental denial of human dignity, like who gets to own property, who gets to be considered a legal person.
Whose life has value.
Exactly. We are talking about matters of existence.
If we refuse to judge the past morally, if we refuse to use words like unjust or oppressive, we are effectively shrugging our shoulders at immense human suffering.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, using moral judgment is actually a way of honoring the victims of the past.
Absolutely. By looking back and stating clearly what happened to you was wrong and the people who did it to you were committing an injustice.
We are actively refusing the romanticization of history.
We are acknowledging that greatness in one arena does not erase wrongdoing in another.
Like, a monarch can be a brilliant military strategist.
And a patron of breathtaking Renaissance art.
Right, while simultaneously being a ruthless tyrant who decimated populations.
We have to be able to use moral language to hold both of those truths.
And beyond just honoring the victims, there is a purely practical, functional reason we have to use moral language.
What's that?
It is about how we actually extract any educational value from the past.
Oh, yes. The learning aspect.
Let me bring in an analogy for you, the listener, to really visualize what happens if we strip morality out of history.
I love a good analogy.
Imagine you walk into a sprawling, beautifully curated history museum. You turn a corner, and sitting there in a glass display case is a medieval rack.
Yikes.
Yeah, an intricately designed wooden torture device. Now, if you operate under the strict rule that we cannot judge the past,
You would have a very weird reaction.
you would have to lean over the glass, observe the gears and the ropes, and say, what a fascinating piece of antique carpentry.
The engineering here is quite innovative for its time.
Right. People back then sure had interesting ways of resolving legal disputes.
Which is an absurd and, frankly, vaguely sociopathic way to interact with that object.
Exactly. You don't look at a device designed to dislocate human joints and praise its craftsmanship while ignoring its purpose.
You recognize it as an instrument of profound suffering.
You feel a chill down your spine because you recognize the dark capacity of human nature that built it.
And your moral judgment is the very thing that allows you to comprehend what the object actually is.
And that chill is essential. To actually learn from history, to make it functional for our present survival, we have to be able to look at the exhibits.
In the vast museum of the human timeline.
Yeah, and say clearly, this was admirable, this was a tragedy, this was a profound injustice.
And the societal mechanisms that allowed this to happen must never be repeated.
Because if you view history merely as interesting difference, you strip it of its teaching value.
It just becomes a catalog of weird things ancient people used to do.
You learn nothing about human nature, power dynamics, or the fragility of justice.
But let me play devil's advocate here and push back on this because I can hear the friction building.
Okay, bring it on.
If we just go through the Museum of History, constantly slapping bright red UNJ stickers on everyone and everything, aren't we missing the point of why they did it in the first place?
That's a fair question.
If our primary mode of historical interaction is just aggressive condemnation, we aren't really trying to understand the mechanics of their world, are we? We're just grandstanding.
This raises an important question, and it is the exact pivot point where the analysis shifts from validating our moral outrage to warning us about its limitations.
Because yes, wrong is wrong, we must acknowledge the harm and use moral language.
But how do we apply that moral language without losing the historical plot entirely?
Right, because if we judge fiercely, bluntly, and without profound contextual awareness, we fall headfirst into a massive intellectual trap.
And that trap brings us to the immense danger of something called presentism.
And the very real risk of historical arrogance.
Presentism. Let's dig into that.
We definitely need to.
Because acknowledging that real harm demands real moral language leads us perfectly into exploring the blind spots of applying that language too enthusiastically.
It does.
I want to understand what we are actually doing to our brains when we judge the past purely through the lens of today.
Well, to understand the blind spots of presentism, we first have to introduce the concept of the moral world of the past.
The moral world.
The people we are so quick to condemn did not live in our world. They lived inside entirely different paradigms.
Like completely different realities.
We are talking about completely different religious frameworks that dictated the literal nature of the cosmos.
Wow, yeah.
We are talking about different economic realities where survival was precarious and labor was conceptualized differently.
And vastly different fundamental assumptions about nature, gender, race, authority, divine right.
And human hierarchy. All of it.
The analogy that comes to mind is trying to run modern 21st century software on a 16th century computer.
That's perfect.
The hardware of their societal norms literally lacked the code to process certain moral computations that seem effortless to us today.
They were operating on a completely different base code.
That is a highly effective way to visualize it.
The text we are examining emphasizes that concepts that feel like absolutely obvious, self-evident moral truths to you today.
Like the idea of universal human rights.
Exactly, or the inherent equality of all genders.
Sure.
Those did not feel obvious at all to someone living 400 years ago.
In fact, to them, your modern views might have seemed chaotic, dangerous, or actively offensive.
Offensive to the natural order of the universe as they understood it.
So if we ignore that context, we fundamentally misunderstand how humans actually thought, operated, and made decisions.
We do.
So how does the source material define presentism in this context? Because it seems like more than just a lack of context.
It feels like an act of distortion.
Yeah, exactly.
Presentism is defined as the mistake of reading the past only through current assumptions, without making any rigorous effort to understand the past on its own terms.
Just projecting ourselves backwards.
Yes. It is the act of taking your modern brain, with all of its contemporary education, its exposure to globalized human rights discourse,
And its modern social conditioning.
and aggressively demanding that someone from the 14th century share your exact worldview.
It is a form of chronocentrism.
Chronocentrism, yes. The arrogant assumption that the specific slice of time we happen to inhabit is the ultimate perfected default setting of human morality.
And the result of that chronocentrism is just shallow outrage.
Very shallow.
It treats history like a massive moral courtroom where we, the enlightened moderns, sit on the bench and bang the gavel.
Finding every single historical figure guilty of not being from the year 2026.
Shallow outrage and entirely distorted history. History isn't just a docket of criminals waiting for our modern verdict.
No, it is a sprawling, complex reality that we desperately need to comprehend.
Because if you approach a historical text only to find out whether the author was a good person by today's standards...
You will almost always find they were not.
Right, and you will learn absolutely nothing about why their world functioned the way it did.
And when we act like that judge, constantly passing retroactive sentences on historical figures, there is a very specific and honestly dangerous psychological mindset we start to adopt.
The source material warns against this heavily. It's this creeping sense of moral vanity.
It warns against the deeply seductive trap of thinking, we would never do that.
We are clearly better.
If I lived back then, I would have seen through the illusions of my society.
Oh, that is such a comfortable, intoxicating thought, isn't it?
It really is.
If I lived in the 1850s, I would have been the one running the Underground Railroad.
I would have been the hero leading the rebellion against the unjust system.
We all want to cast ourselves as the protagonist who defies the era.
It is incredibly comfortable, but statistically and historically, it is almost certainly false.
Ouch. Yeah.
The analysis argues that this mindset quickly curdles into self-congratulation and moral vanity.
And the real danger here isn't just that we are being unfair to the dead.
No, the danger is that this self-congratulation entirely blinds us to the injustices of our own era.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want you, the listener, to do a deeply uncomfortable mental exercise with us.
Brace yourself.
I want you to imagine future generations, say historians looking back from the year 2300, examining you right now in your current daily life.
What totally normal thing are you doing today?
Something you don't even think twice about. Something that just seems like a standard, unavoidable part of surviving in the modern global economy.
That they will find absolutely horrifying.
It is a terrifying thought experiment.
Because it forces us to realize that we are also trapped in a paradigm. We are not at the end of moral evolution.
Exactly. Maybe those historians in 2300 will look back at how we treat the environment.
Viewing our consumption of fossil fuels and our disposal of plastics as an act of generational violence.
Maybe they will look at the global supply chains, the sweatshops, and the conditions in which our smartphones and fast fashion are manufactured.
And view us as deeply complicit in a brutal system of global economic subjugation.
Maybe they will look at our factory farming system, the way we mass produce and slaughter animals, and view us as absolute barbarians.
And they will read our texts and say, how could they not see it? They had the data. It was so obvious.
And if that future generation uses the blunt weapon of presentism on us, they will simply condemn you and me as evil, malicious actors.
They won't try to understand the economic gridlock we were born into.
Or the psychological distance created by globalized supply chains.
Or the intense societal pressures we navigated just to pay our rent. They'll just label us monsters.
That is why the text heavily emphasizes that judging the past too harshly, without rigorous context, leaves us utterly unprepared for how the future will eventually judge us.
Every age tends to see some of its own profound wrongs as perfectly normal, unavoidable, or even necessary.
So context acts as a necessary lens to view the past accurately.
What?
And this is a massive... But we cannot let context become a get-out-of-jail-free card.
You really can't.
We have established that the moral world of the past was different, but we are walking a very thin tightrope here.
How do we balance understanding a society's deeply flawed norms without just shrugging our shoulders and excusing the terrible actions of the individuals who perpetuated them?
That tension is the absolute crux of the issue.
And the source material provides a crucial, razor-sharp distinction to help us navigate it.
Let's hear it.
It is the vital distinction between understanding and excusing.
Ah, okay.
The analysis explicitly states that understanding why a person believes something or how they arrived at a horrific conclusion is categorically different from excusing the moral weight of that conclusion.
I want to make sure this is crystal clear for the listener. Walk us through the mechanics of that distinction.
Sure.
What does that actually look like when we apply it to historical research?
Let's look at a historical reality. You can rigorously study the sociological mechanisms of how a person raised in a 19th century slave-holding society came to accept slavery as a natural law.
You can analyze the agrarian economics of their region.
You can read the specific theological sermons they heard every Sunday that twisted religious texts to justify subjugation.
You can examine the legal structures that normalized it.
And the intensive social conditioning they endured from the moment they were born.
By doing all of this, you can perfectly map out the psychological and sociological journey of how that individual arrived at their worldview.
You can understand the architecture of their bigotry.
You can see the exact mathematical formula of their conditioning. You can trace the variables that resulted in their worldview.
Precisely. You see the formula. However, the text is adamant on this point.
What's the point?
Possessing that psychological and sociological understanding does not mean the institution of slavery suddenly becomes morally neutral or acceptable.
Right. Understanding the mechanism of the wrong does not erase the wrongness of the wrong.
So, to use an analogy, if you study toxicology, you can completely understand the chemical composition of a deadly poison.
You can understand exactly how it interacts with the human bloodstream.
And you can understand the precise process by which it was synthesized in a lab.
But knowing exactly how the poison was made doesn't mean it's suddenly a healthy beverage.
It is still poison, and it will still kill you.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of historical analysis, it provides us with a deeply balanced rule of engagement.
Historical context explains the genesis of wrongdoing.
It illuminates the human capacity to normalize horror.
And in some specific cases, it might even mitigate the degree of personal blame we assign to a specific individual.
Which we will delve into shortly.
But historical context never, ever automatically neutralizes moral criticism.
We are tasked with maintaining the intellectual stamina to avoid two extreme pitfalls simultaneously.
We must avoid the arrogance of extreme condemnation without context.
And we must fiercely avoid using context as a blanket excuse for atrocity.
And one of the most compelling reasons we cannot use context as a blanket excuse, this idea that, well, everyone just thought that way back then.
It's because that idea is actually a massive historical myth, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
When we actually look at the data, the past was not just one giant unified brain processing the same unquestioned thoughts.
It is one of the most pervasive myths in popular history. The past was never a monolith.
The text we're analyzing makes a massive point regarding this. Not everyone had the same access to moral insight.
We have this terrible habit of flattening centuries of complex human thought into sweeping generalizations.
We say things like, well, the 1700s believed this, or the Victorians thought that.
But the 1700s, as an abstract concept, didn't believe anything. Millions of highly individualistic human beings living in the 1700s had beliefs.
And those beliefs varied wildly, often clashing violently, based on their position within the societal hierarchy.
Let me stop you there, because the concept of unequal access to moral insight is fascinating.
Break down what that spectrum of access actually looked like in a historical society.
On one extreme end of the spectrum, you had individuals who were intentionally kept in profound ignorance,
We are talking about people with absolutely zero formal education.
who possessed no literacy and who had zero exposure to dissenting views or foreign cultures.
They lived in deeply isolated communities where the dominant oppressive norm was the only reality they were ever allowed to perceive.
Furthermore, they had no systemic power to resist those norms, even if a nascent moral intuition told them something was wrong.
Their access to alternative moral frameworks was heavily restricted, if not entirely severed.
They were trapped in a sociocultural gravity, well, that they lacked the intellectual and literal capital to escape.
Exactly. But on the complete opposite end of the spectrum,
You had individuals who were highly educated polymaths.
they traveled across continents, they read philosophical treatises in multiple languages, they engaged in vigorous debates.
And crucially, they often directly designed and massively profited from the oppressive systems in place.
They possessed vast resources and the intellectual tools to question the morality of their society.
But they actively, repeatedly chose never to do so because the status quo was highly lucrative for them.
So flattening both of those groups, the isolated, uneducated peasant and the wealthy, globe-trotting architect of the system,
Into the exact same defensive category of they were just people of their time.
it completely erases these massive foundational differences in opportunity, agency, and complicity.
It is a profound historical injustice to treat them as equally blind.
And that brings us to the ultimate, devastating counterargument against the product of their time defense.
It is the historical reality of the voices of dissent.
Because the truth is, there were people who absolutely knew better.
Yes, this is the part of the deep dive that completely shatters the illusion of inevitable historical ignorance.
The analysis delivers a major blow to the nobody could have known better narrative.
By emphasizing a vital historical truth. In almost every single period of historical injustice, no matter how entrenched or normalized the cruelty was, there were already voices clearly, loudly stating this is wrong.
Even in the darkest, most seemingly unified eras of oppression, there was always someone, somewhere, holding up a lantern.
Pointing at the rod and the floorboards.
Historically, there have always been abolitionists who fought slavery from its very inception.
There were early critics of imperial conquest, like Bartolomé de las Casas in the 16th century,
who documented and fiercely condemned the brutal subjugation of indigenous peoples in the Americas.
while his contemporaries justified it.
There are religious groups like the Quakers who recognized the inherent equality of human beings long before it was legally popular.
There have always been individuals who argued for the dignity of the excluded and challenged accepted hierarchies.
They existed. They wrote extensive pamphlets. They spoke out in public squares.
So what does this all mean for our modern debate?
It means that when someone lazily waves their hand to defend a historical figure by saying, hey, give him a break, You have to view them in context. They were just a product of their time.
We can actually push back with hard historical data.
We can say, I am viewing them in context. And in that exact same context, walking the exact same streets, breathing the exact same political air, other people clearly saw the injustice.
Why was your guy seemingly incapable of seeing what his contemporaries were already writing books about?
That is precisely the counter-argument that weakens the defense of historical inevitability.
The existence of contemporary dissent proves that the dominant oppressive norms were not the only possible norms available to the human mind at that time.
Alternatives were cognitively available.
And if alternatives were available, it proves that moral blindness was, at least in part, an active choice.
Or, at the very least, it was a profound failure of moral imagination, rather than an absolute, inescapable biological limitation of the era.
But hold on, because this brings up a massive, head-spinning dilemma for the listener.
If some people knew better and others didn't, how do we fairly judge the ones who didn't?
How do we actually grade these historical figures?
Because right now, the tension is immense. We have to acknowledge real harm and use moral language.
But we have to avoid the chronocentrism of presentism.
We have to deeply understand the sociological context, but we cannot use that context to excuse the action.
We have to recognize unequal access to moral insight, but also honor the voices of dissent that prove alternative thinking was possible.
How do we practically do this without our brains short-circuiting? It feels like we are asking the listener to juggle flaming swords while riding a unicycle.
What's fascinating here is that the source analysis recognizes this exact cognitive overload.
Thank goodness.
The tension you are feeling is real, and it exists because the very word judging is fundamentally flawed.
Too broad.
It is too broad. It is too blunt of an instrument. We're trying to use a sledgehammer to perform microscopic neurological surgery.
To solve this intellectual gridlock, the text provides a structural solution.
We must break the monolithic concept of judging down into 3 distinct, manageable categories. We need a rigorous framework.
A framework. Perfect. Listeners, if you are driving or making dinner, mentally bookmark this section because this is the toolkit.
How does the analysis categorize our judgment?
Let's get into it.
The first category in the framework is the moral evaluation of actions.
This is the baseline, and it is the most straightforward level of historical judgment.
At this level, we can, and we absolutely should, legitimately state that a specific action, policy, or systemic belief was wrong.
Harmful, degrading, or unjust.
At this stage, the action itself is objectively evaluated, entirely separate from the complex biography of the human being who committed it.
So to apply this, the action of keeping another human being as chattel property is a profound moral wrong. Full stop.
The action of violently displacing an indigenous population is unjust. Full stop.
The action of legally excluding women from owning property is degrading. Full stop.
We don't need to dive into the nuanced, tragic backstory of the perpetrator to evaluate the objective harm of the action itself.
The action is on trial here, not the era and not the soul of the person.
Exactly. The action is evaluated by those deeper, transcendent standards of suffering and domination we discussed in the very beginning of the deep dive.
That is the first category, and it provides our moral anchor.
But then we must step into the second category, which is vastly more complicated.
The judgment of the whole person.
This is where it gets incredibly messy, because human beings are frustratingly complex.
We are not just the sum of one single action or one single belief.
We are a chaotic bundle of contradictions. And the central question the text asks in this second category is, does one terrible belief or one participation in an unjust system entirely define and negate an entire human life?
The historical reality is that major figures are almost always morally mixed.
You will constantly encounter individuals who are deeply, profoundly insightful, courageous, or innovative in one specific area of human existence,
while remaining tragically, horrifically blind or actively cruel in another.
Brings us right back to the Thomas Jefferson paradox we started with.
We have a man who possessed the philosophical brilliance to articulate a vision of human equality.
That became the bedrock of democratic movements worldwide.
Yet he lacked the moral courage or the ethical clarity to apply that equality to the hundreds of human beings he legally owned and forced into labor on his own plantation.
It is a staggering contradiction.
And the framework demands that we develop the intellectual maturity to hold two deeply conflicting thoughts in our minds at the exact same time.
Without letting one erase the other.
We must be able to look at a historical figure and say, this specific part of their legacy is incredibly valuable, innovative, and worthy of study.
And this other part of their legacy is morally ugly, deeply unjust and worthy of severe condemnation.
We have to resist the deeply human urge to sort history into neat piles of absolute heroes and absolute villains.
We want to paint them entirely in shining gold or entirely in filthy mud because it makes the narrative easier to digest.
But they are usually a very uncomfortable, complex shade of gray.
Which naturally leads us to the third and final category of the framework, which is where we decide how to handle that gray area.
The third category is the judgment of blameworthiness.
This is entirely about personal guilt and culpability.
This is where we stop looking at just the action or just the biography, and we start asking the probing, granular questions about agency.
How much did this specific individual actually know?
How much systemic power did they possess?
Did they actively reinforce and expand the injustice, or did they just passively inherit it and fail to question it?
I love this because it maps perfectly onto a modern legal framework.
It really does.
Think about it, listeners. It's like navigating a complex trial.
First, you have to distinguish the crime itself. Was a law broken? Was harm caused?
That maps to our first category, evaluating the action.
Then you examine the character and history of the defendant. Are they a habitual offender? Do they have a history of philanthropy alongside their crime?
That is our second category, judging the whole person.
And finally, the judge considers the mitigating or aggravating circumstances that affect the actual sentencing phase.
Were they coerced? Were they the mastermind? What was their level of intent?
That is our third category, assessing blameworthiness.
That legal analogy captures the exact mechanism the text is proposing.
A mature, sophisticated historical morality requires carefully balancing all three of those categories.
You unequivocally acknowledge the wrongness of the act.
You accept the messy complexity of the person.
And you heavily weigh the importance of the historical context to determine their final blameworthiness.
This third category is where historical context matters the absolute most.
Context doesn't retroactively change the moral nature of the crime, but it heavily, heavily influences the harshness of the sentencing.
So we have the theory. We have the legal framework for our historical courtroom.
But how do we put this into practice outside of a deep dive?
How do we actually approach history with this balanced mindset on a daily basis?
When we are reading the news or walking past a controversial statue.
Because the analysis shifts here from the purely theoretical framework of judgment to the practical, everyday mindset the listener should adopt.
We want to give you a masterclass approach.
The source outlines a very clear, highly practical approach broken down into 3 essential tools.
If you want to judge the past without falling into the trap of presentism, but also without becoming historically naive and excusing atrocity, you need to arm yourself with these 3 principles.
Knowledge, humility, and scale.
Knowledge, humility, and scale. Let's break those down one by one.
What does knowledge demand of us in this context? Because it has to be more than just reading a Wikipedia summary.
Knowledge in this context means doing the rigorous historical homework before you publicly cast your judgment.
Before you tweet your outrage or demand a name be removed from a building.
Or, conversely, before you aggressively defend a historical figure from criticism.
You have an obligation to learn the deep context.
Understand the specific granular norms of their exact decade and location.
Find out what alternative moral frameworks actually existed and were accessible to them.
And crucially, investigate the power dynamics. Ask who was resisting the system versus who was actively complying with it, and where your subject fell on that spectrum.
Don't operate on assumptions or modern political talking points. Investigate the actual historical record.
It is the absolute antithesis of the knee-jerk reaction.
It is a slow, methodical, almost investigative process.
You have to put in the effort to read the room before you judge the room, even if that room existed 3 centuries ago.
Okay, so that is knowledge. The second tool is humility.
We touched on this briefly with the thought experiment about the future judging us, but let's dive deeper into how humility functions as a tool rather than just a feeling.
Humility functions as a critical check on our own chronocentrism.
It requires us to constantly, actively remember our own generational blind spots.
We must remember that we are not the final, perfected judges sitting on some flawless moral mountaintop at the very end of human evolution.
We are deeply flawed actors stumbling through our own incredibly messy, morally compromised era.
However, and this is a critical caveat, that the text firmly establishes, Humility does not mean staying silent in the face of historical or present injustice.
Right. I want to underscore that for the listener. Humility is not an excuse for intellectual cowardice.
It doesn't mean we throw our hands up, say, well, nobody's perfect, who am I to judge, and casually walk away from discussing horrific historical abuses.
That is nihilism, not humility.
There is a massive difference between humility and moral apathy.
Humility simply means executing your judgment without the toxic addition of self-righteousness.
It means having the courage to call out the historical wrong while maintaining the self-awareness to recognize that you, too, are entirely capable of being wrong in your own current context.
It is moral judgment tempered by a profound awareness of human fallibility.
Okay, we have knowledge to ground us in facts. We have humility to check our arrogance.
Now let's talk about the third and final tool, scale.
This concept feels like the secret ingredient that could solve a massive percentage of the shouting matches we see on the internet today regarding historical figures.
Scale is absolutely essential for maintaining any sense of historical proportion.
The text emphasizes a hard truth. Not all historical wrongs are created equal, and not all participants in an unjust system bear the same weight of culpability.
We have to recognize the vast, undeniable difference in scale between a person who is casually, passively sharing the common, unquestioned assumptions of their era
Versus a person who is actively designing, fiercely defending, massively profiting from, or intentionally intensifying a massive injustice.
So let's put this in perspective for the listener. There is a massive categorical difference in scale between an impoverished 18th century farmer who holds deeply prejudiced views because he has literally never encountered a world outside his village or read a book challenging those views.
And the wealthy, educated architect of a colonial empire who deliberately drafts the legislation to strip human beings of their rights in order to maximize his own profit margins.
Scale determines the true weight of responsibility.
It determines the shape of their ultimate historical legacy.
And going back to our framework, it determines the harshness of the judgment and the blameworthiness we should apply.
If we use the blunt instrument of presentism to treat the passive, uneducated participant and the active, highly resourced architect with the exact same level of vitriol and condemnation, we lose all sense of proportion.
We flatten history into a cartoon.
We have to measure the scale of their complicity, the scale of their power, and the scale of their intent.
As we bring all of these complex threads together, as we pull back the lens on this incredibly dense deep dive,
We want to synthesize a clear answer to the core question that brought us here today.
after navigating the necessity of moral language, the trap of presentism, the reality of unequal access, and the three-part framework of judgment,
Is it right to judge people from the past by today's moral standards?
the summary synthesized from the source material provides a beautifully balanced, albeit demanding, answer.
Yes.
We can, and we absolutely must, make moral judgments about the actions of the past.
Especially when we are dealing with real suffering, domination, and profound systemic injustice.
We must do this because the victims of those systems mattered then, and the memory of their suffering matters now.
To ignore their pain under the guise of historical context is to commit a second retroactive injustice against them. But we cannot judge lazily. We are forbidden from taking the easy way out.
We must judge morally and historically at the exact same time.
We must name the injustice clearly, and we must aggressively avoid romanticizing cruelty.
Yet simultaneously, we have to maintain enough deep, rigorous context to separate a sociological explanation from a moral excuse.
And to separate the uncomfortable reality of human complexity from the cowardice of outright denial.
It is not a binary choice between never judge anyone and judge everyone harshly and burn it all down.
It is about committing to the hard, exhausting, vital intellectual work of judging wisely.
As we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a few lingering thoughts.
The source text poses some phenomenal closing questions that I really want you to mull over as you go about your day.
When you consume history, whether you are reading a biography, watching a documentary, or looking at a monument, what are you actually looking for?
Are you searching for a pure, flawless hero to validate your own beliefs?
Are you looking for a cartoonish, one-dimensional villain to easily condemn so you can feel superior?
Or are you willing to do the hard work of looking for a complex, messy, deeply contradictory human being?
It requires vastly more mental energy to seek out and understand the complex human being, but it is the only viable path to finding anything resembling the historical truth.
And building on the source's profound warning about moral vanity, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to take with you.
Think about this today, especially the next time you see a massive online controversy about a historical figure.
Are we sometimes so incredibly eager to aggressively, loudly judge the moral failures of people who lived 300 years ago simply because it distracts us?
Does loudly condemning the ghosts of the past serve as a convenient, emotionally satisfying distraction from the exhausting, messy, incredibly difficult work of fixing the systemic injustices happening right in our own backyards today?
Is our intense historical outrage sometimes just an easy, low-stakes substitute for actual present-day action?
It is infinitely easier to tear down the legacy of a dead person than it is to build a more just and equitable society for the living.
Let that sit with you.
As you navigate the world today, don't just judge the foundation of the monuments built centuries ago.
Ask yourself what kind of moral foundation you are laying right now, today, through your own actions, for the monument that the future will eventually build upon, and judge, long after we are gone.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning your assumptions, keep seeking the nuance, and keep diving deep.